Hi, everyone. Today we're looking at the second set of chapters from the John Broome book, Climate Matters. Um, and today's lecture is going to be a bit more difficult to do um, without, without meeting in person in our classroom, especially with what Broome calls expected value theory. Uh, I usually give a few examples in class where we work through some numbers to see how it works. It's not going to be so simple this time. So just do your best to try and get an understanding of how this works. Have a look at the examples that Broome gives in the text, and um, and also if questions remain, um, feel free to email me, and I'll try to run you through it. Um, but so it's not an ideal situation, but we'll just do our best to try and get a concept of what that is. Um, so um, Uh, so let's start with expected value theory. And then after that, a couple more things that we want to touch on today. Um, One is discounting future value. Um, so the idea that things that happen in the future are somehow worth less, have a lesser value, simply because of their occurring in the future. So an example of this is that you'd rather have $1,000 now, if you discount, you'd rather have that now than the same $1,000 in 10 years, um, even adjusted for inflation. So say it's worth the same in the future on the market and everything. But there's something more valuable about having it now. That leads to various puzzles in climate ethics, as we'll see, because um, many of the impacts are going to be in the future, some of them the distant future. Um, and the other thing that we're going to look at is the non-identity problem, which is also a difficult concept, and we'll touch on that as well. So three things today: expected value theory, um, expected value theory, discounting future value, and the non-identity problem. So start with expected value. The problem with trying to think about the ethics of climate change, or one of the big problems, is that we're uncertain about what exactly is going to happen in the future, right? So climate change is already happening. It's a problem now, of course, um, but it's going to remain a problem no matter what we do, even if we get really serious about it all of a sudden, which is unlikely. But it's going to remain a problem for decades, even centuries. So the impacts will be felt for a long time. Um, and although it's, as we discussed a couple weeks ago, it's very clear that climate change is real and that it's caused by human beings and that it poses very serious risks to humans and non-human systems in nature. That leaves room for a lot of uncertainty about exactly how bad it's going to be, who's going to be affected, where, and to what degree. And this isn't because of flaws in the basic science of climate change, but it's just a reflection of the fact that the world is a very complex place, right? The climate system alone is extremely complex, hard to understand, not easy to model. And on top of that, how climate change affects humans will depend on a bunch of stuff beyond just the climate system. So it'll depend upon what we choose to do at the policy level. How do we respond? It'll have to do with the economic impacts. Right? It'll depend upon human behavior and choices in all sorts of ways. And nobody can predict that, right, with anything approaching certainty, right? So think back, if you lived 100 years ago, try to predict what the world would look like today, and there's almost no chance that you would get it right. So you wouldn't even be able to imagine many of the technologies and that exist, that some of the jobs that we have, the things that people just do on a normal daily basis. There's no way to predict that stuff 100 years in the past. So just think about that going into the future. We don't know what's going to happen. Now, that doesn't mean we're completely ignorant. So we can make some reasonable educated guesses. So, we can assume it'll probably be bad for people to have frequent, say, heat waves. Can't imagine future people will enjoy that. And climate change certainly raises the risk of that kind of thing happening more frequently. But exactly how often, where, when, that's uncertain. But again, that doesn't mean that we're completely in the dark. So what climate scientists do is they use climate models. So these are, think of them as programs that run on these fancy supercomputers that simulate the climate, right? So the models are getting better over time. There are different kinds of models. Some of them include not just the sort of geophysical side of things, but also economic impacts that are modeled in various ways. And if you're wondering how do they come up with these, their job is to try and give us a picture of what the future might look like. But obviously, you can't test that against the future because the future hasn't happened yet, right? So it's not like you come up with the model and say, okay, let's look at the future. Did our model get it right? Well, you're going to have to wait a few hundred years to see, or decades to see the near-term impacts. Obviously, we can't do that. But what you can do is you can run those models and see if they get the past correct. So you have a picture of how the climate system works, right? It's modeled on your fancy supercomputer. And then you run simulations. And again, it depends on the model, but it will simulate things like temperature increase, precipitation changes. It might do things like sea level rise. And in the ones that have an economic model, can tell you something about the impacts on GDP and things like that. And you sort of run that for the past. So imagine you say, okay, let's take this model, let's start it in the year 1900, and let's see what the model produces over the next 120 years. And the way it works is the model simulates thousands of times. It sort of runs not just once, but a bunch of times, so that you can take all that data and get an overall picture, and then compare that to, okay, we know what actually happened between 1900 and whatever year we're in now. Is it 2020? And now you can compare. You can say, okay, did the model get the temperature increase correct for that 120 years? Did it get precipitation changes correct? Sea level rise, all that stuff. So you can't test that looking to the past. You can't test it to the future. But if your model gets the past correct, right? If it correctly models what we know has happened, then that gives us some reason to be confident in it, to think that, okay, well, at least it gets the past right. It might have something going for it. That gives us some reason to think that we can rely on it for modeling the future as well. If you have some model that just gets the past completely wrong, then that's a pretty good indication that it's not a good model, probably not one you want to use, right? And so again, these models are routinely used by scientists, but they, more than anyone, caution that there's a lot of uncertainty here. It's not like these models tell you exactly what's going to happen in the future. That's not what they're meant to do, and no serious professional who understands this stuff would ever claim that. So that's something that probably hasn't been communicated to the public very well. So when the media reports, say, new findings from a scientific paper, they're often sensationalized, right? To the point, they say something like, scientists say that we're all going to die in 100 years or something. They don't quite say it that starkly, but that's not what the scientists will say. Rather, it's much more nuanced, right? There's a lot of caveats, whereas, okay, this model predicts that we might be looking at, say, 6 degrees of warming under certain scenarios. That could be very, very bad for human health and economic well-being, and other things too. And then maybe the newspaper just says, oh, this is what they predict. But it's not so much a prediction. Rather, there's going to be a probability attached to that. And here's the uncertainty. So the climate models they don't say 100% this is what's going to happen. Rather, they look at different scenarios. So, for example, say we cut our emissions drastically over the next 20 years and then run the model and see what happens under that scenario. Another scenario, imagine that we do nothing to cut our emissions, right? Run the same model and see what happens. You would expect climate change to be worse in these scenarios in which we don't do anything than the ones in which we cut our emissions. And that's, of course, generally what you see. But even if we assume a certain scenario, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen, right? So say we do cut our emissions, a model might show that there's still a small chance. Our model might show that there's still a small chance that that say we have 5 or 6 degrees Celsius warming over the next 200 years or something like that, which would be, that's unlucky, right? That we do a lot of work, but there's still a small chance that that we're going to look at extremely dangerous climate change. But the probability is much higher generally in those cases in which we do little or nothing to cut our emissions. So no model, right, as serious science, no model is going to tell you, yeah, this is definitely what happens under these scenarios. Rather, it gives a range of probabilities. And this is why we have uncertainty, right? So the question is, when you're not certain what an outcome will be, how should you act? And there are different approaches to this. So one set of approaches focuses a lot on precaution. So you may have heard of precautionary principles before. There's about approximately 8,000 different versions of the precautionary principle, so it's hard to state a single one. But what they all have in common is the idea that we should try to avoid bad outcomes. We should be cautious, right? We should exercise precaution to do everything we can, or maybe everything, but a significant amount, to try and avoid very dangerous outcomes. So one precautionary approach might be something along the lines of the idea of being better safe than sorry. We should, according to a certain precautionary way of thinking, run the risk of spending a lot more to fight climate change than we need, just to be sure, or as close to sure as possible, that we avoid, say, civilization-ending climate change. Precautionary approaches put a lot of value in being willing to give up certain benefits in order to be as sure as possible, or as close to sure as possible, that we avoid disaster, catastrophe. And Broom talks about this, the precautionary approach, a little bit, and he says, well, it depends what version you're talking about. Some forms of precaution make a lot of sense and seem perfectly reasonable, but others can be too extreme, to the point where they may do more harm than good. And this is an important point to see, whether you agree with him or not ultimately, that you might think, well, what's wrong with exercising precaution? But if you think about your own daily life, nobody exercises extreme precaution in everything that they do, right? We all take risks. So, for right now, it's a little different, but say on a normal daily basis, should I leave my house to go to work and see friends? I don't have any friends, but should I leave my house to do stuff? We all think that's worth doing, right? Even though there's a risk involved. Might get in a car accident, right? A piano might fall out of a window and kill me. All those things, they're low probability, but they could happen, right? Some of them are higher probabilities than others. But we all decide, whether we explicitly think it through or not, we all effectively decide through our behavior that the risks are worth it, right? We still get on planes, well, sometimes. Even though, well, there could be a plane crash, it's unlikely, and if it happened, it would be really bad. But if we reason it through, we think it's very unlikely to happen, and we decide that the benefits outweigh the costs, right? That, well, going to visit my family or friends is worth the very tiny risk that I might die. Um, so Broom thinks that we need, in his view, that we should uh, be careful about careful about using precaution when it comes to climate change. So think about this. We might invest everything we got in avoiding dangerous climate change. You might say, okay, let's shut down fossil fuels today. Let's spend every penny investing in renewable energy, in reforestation. Let's shut down all cattle production so we don't have methane emissions. Pass laws to force everyone to switch to a vegan diet, which is much less carbon intensive than a meat-based diet. You could do all those things, and imagine it all works, and we do avoid climate change. But there's a bunch of costs involved, right? And you got to ask where the costs worth the getting close to a zero risk of dangerous climate change. Well, if the economy is wrecked and no one has a job, right? So, which might happen anyway. But if the economy is totally ruined, no one has a job anymore, we're all living in poverty. Well, yeah, we've avoided dangerous climate change, but our lives are miserable, and probably many people are going to die, not from climate change, but now from other causes, right, related to poverty or something else. And nobody thinks that's a good idea, right? That's just an extreme example to show that, well, precaution, in Broom's view, is not the only thing that we should be focused on, right? Of course, it makes sense to try and avoid bad scenarios, but the question is, how far should you go to avoid that? If you get to the point where you're causing all sorts of other damage and serious harm to avoid just one dangerous possible outcome, at some point, Broom thinks it becomes not worth it anymore. So, of course, he thinks that we should do a lot to fight climate change, but we should also continue to invest in other things, right? Like education, things like that. That you don't want to suck everything else, suck the funds out of everything else and focus just on climate change, because that ignores the other good stuff that we have in life. So that raises a question. So if we can't just say a certain extreme version of the precautionary principle, do everything you can to avoid climate disaster, if that's not the right way to go, then what should we do, right? Given the fact that we're uncertain about the possible outcomes, how do we behave? And Broom thinks the right way to go is to rely on what's known as expected value theory. It's sometimes called expected utility theory. Utility is just another word for value or well-being, so it just means good stuff. Remember, we've talked a bit about the ethical theory known as utilitarianism. That's the idea that you should maximize utility or well-being in the world. Broom uses the term expected value. So what is expected value? So this is a common technique that's used in economics and various other fields. When we can't predict the future with certainty, which is with most things at the policy level, we need some way of taking into account both the probability of different outcomes and how good or bad each of those outcomes would be. Dog found a ball over here. Hey, Annabelle, come up. Come up. Want to say hi? No? All right. Yep. So expected value looks at a possible policy, right, and says, okay, call this policy A. If it's climate change, say policy A is we drastically cut our emissions, and there's a bunch of details that go into it. Doesn't matter for now. Just say we have a policy. Say we do this. The climate models show, okay, if you do this, here's the possible outcomes. And we run the model a few thousand times, and we see that, okay, there's a 20% probability that you're going to have, say, an increase in temperature of 2 degrees, a 50% probability that you're going to have an increase of 3 degrees. and I forget my numbers, and the other percent is an increase of, say, 6 degrees. What you do then is you now have probabilities for those different outcomes, right? So some are more likely than others. The next thing you do is you assign a value to those things. How good or bad would those outcomes be? Now, this isn't easy to do. If you do it in economic terms, you might, you might do it in terms of GDP or GWP, gross world product, where you look at the economic gains or losses, and you assign those values to those different outcomes. So an increase of 6 degrees would be perhaps catastrophic, right? It would be bad and probably very bad. Whereas an increase of 2 degrees or 3 degrees probably will cause some damage, but would be much less bad than those other outcomes. So to calculate the expected value of a possible outcome, what you do is you multiply the probability by the value. So say that there's a 30% probability of something happening. Let's say the 6 degrees increase, that's a probability of 0.3. So 1 would be 100%, 0.3 is 30%. So 0.3 times multiplied by whatever the value of that outcome would be. So if we have it in terms of monetary terms, say it's a gain of $100 billion, well, then that would be 0.3 times 100 billion. And what's that? That's 30 billion, right? Yeah. That's the expected value for that possible outcome, $30 billion. So the expected value of an outcome is just the term that takes into account both the probability, the likelihood of something happening, and the value of it. So how good or bad it would be. In this case, pretty good, gaining 100 billion. But that gets scaled down to 30 billion because there's only a 0.3 chance of it happening, according to the models. And then you do the same thing for the other two outcomes on this policy. Multiply the probability, that's 0.6 or whatever, 0.2, times the value of that. And you're going to get positive or negative numbers, right? So the positive ones, expected value of, say, making $30 billion. But in the bad outcomes, there's, say, a probability of 0.2 of a loss of a trillion. So that's a loss of 200 billion in expected value. You now have numbers for each outcome that's considered under the policy. So this number takes into account, again, both the probability of the outcome and the value of it. So it's a way to get one number that represents both of those things. Now that you have those three numbers, so the three numbers that represent the expected value for each of the possible outcomes, you add those numbers together. So some of those numbers might be negative, some might be positive, but you add them together, you end up with a single number for the policy overall. And that's called the expected value for the policy. It's going to be a positive number or a negative number. That represents the expected value of the policy as a whole. And again, this number represents, okay, there are different possible outcomes if we do this policy. In my example, there were 3. So maybe outcome number 1 happens, outcome number 2, outcome number 3. We don't know which one, but we know that each of those has a different probability. We assign those probabilities. We also assign the values. But we want a way to represent that in terms of a single number for the policy as a whole. That's why you add together the expected values for each outcome, and you end up with that single number. Now you do the same exact thing for the other policies that are under consideration. So we did that for policy A, now do it for policy B, C, D, whatever's on the table. Generate these expected value numbers, and then you just compare them, Broom thinks. So you pick the one that has the highest expected value. So if that's policy B, then policy B is the one that we should do according to expected value theory. Um, Now that doesn't mean that it's a guarantee that doing policy B is going to bring, in fact, the best possible outcome. It might be the case that the best possible outcome was in one of the other policies. But if the probability of that happening is pretty low, then expected value theory says it's not a smart idea to go chasing that. Because yeah, it'd be great if it happened, but it probably won't. And you're probably going to end up being worse off if you pursue that other policy. So that's just sort of explaining that verbally is pretty difficult. Again, I like to use numbers if we were in the classroom, but that's my best attempt at trying to explain expected value theory. Important thing to remember is that it's a number that takes into account both the likelihood, the probability of a certain event happening, and how good or bad that is. And Broom thinks that's a better way to go because unlike precaution, which says, okay, avoid the worst outcome at all costs, Broom thinks, well, wait a minute, if the worst outcome is very unlikely, it might be worth taking that risk, right? Just like it's worth taking the risk of getting on an airplane, because although if it crashes, that'd be pretty bad if you're on it, probably won't happen, right? So it's probably not very rational to live your life thinking that, yeah, I want to avoid the worst possible outcome at all costs, even when that outcome has a probability of almost zero, right? But not quite zero. You know. Okay, so Broom thinks that's the way to think about climate policy. That what we need is keep improving the models, getting better data, and keep running those models to try and get better information so that policymakers can choose the policies that have the highest expected value. Of course, that assumes that they're interested in trying to do that, which is another question. But let's pretend for a moment that that policymakers had the interests of human beings at heart and wanted to pursue that. Broom thinks, well, the best way to do that is to rely on expected value theory when it comes to cases like climate change because of the uncertainty. Okay, so the next two things will be quicker. What was the second one? Discounting future value. So this is a common practice in economics to put less value on something that happens in the future than something that happens in the near term. So economists typically use a discount rate, and banks and financial institutions would use this. And even though they do, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Various institutions use this, it's very common. And Broom thinks when it comes to commodities, it makes sense, right? So would you rather, again, go back to my example before, would you rather have $1,000 now or $1,000 in 10 years, even adjusted for inflation? Well, if you have the $1,000 now, you can do stuff with that, right? You could invest that, you could survive with it maybe. Whereas if you wait for 10 years, it might be not much use to you, or at least less use, right? And that goes for other, not just money, but various commodities like, if you're selling apples or something, right? Well, you got to sell stuff now, right? To start building up your business. That's good for you. Say we sell no apples for the first 10 years, but after that, it's going to be great. Might not be such a great move, right? Because you want to stay in business. The problem is that although Broom thinks this works fine for commodities, it doesn't work for the value of human lives. And this is potentially a problem. Remember, with expected value theory, we need some way to calculate or estimate the value or the disvalue, the goodness or the badness of various outcomes. And the most common way to do that is to use economic models, even though no one thinks that they would capture everything, right? You can't boil everything down in life to economic value, pretty sure at least. But that's what we got right now. Broom thinks that's maybe the best thing we can rely on. But when we're talking about the value of lives, which is one big part of climate change, because a lot of people are going to die from it, and which policies we choose will determine how many will have to die and how many won't, and also how many will be harmed and have their lives, the value of their lives reduced, the value in their lives. Broom thinks, well, if we start discounting that, there's something ethically off about that, right? That seems messed up, right? So if I say that, okay, somebody who lives 100 years from now is just worth less than us, Broom thinks, well, that doesn't seem right. What would be the justification for that? It seems that all people are equal, right? From a moral point of view, there's no reason, he thinks, to believe that people who come in the future are somehow of less value than we are. Now, it is the case that psychologically, right, humans tend to focus more on the near term and the present than we do on the future, right? We probably care more about ourselves and the people we know today than the strangers who will live in 1,000 years. But that's just a psychological fact about us, right? That doesn't bring with it necessarily any moral justification for giving, say, fewer rights to those in the future than we give to those in the present. Another way to look at this, look at it from the point of view of someone who lived 2,000 years ago. From their point of view, if they discounted the value of future lives, then you and I would be practically worthless from their point of view. It would be the case, and something I should have mentioned, the way the discounting works is that it discounts according to a rate. So say every year, for example. Something good now has a value at, say, 100%. Say you have a 1%, 2%, 3% discount rate. Well, it doesn't take very long for the value of something to become close to zero, right? So that's why we, from the point of view of those in the past, would have almost no weight put on our well-being whatsoever if we use a discount rate, or if the people in the past had used a discount rate for us. And now you might object, you might think, well, wait, no, we're not worthless, right? We matter. But if you think that, then it seems that people in the future would matter too. And Broom believes that we ought not, it would be wrong, he thinks, to discount the value of future lives. Although it does make sense to discount the value of commodities, right? So again, because, for example, you can invest, say, money that you have now, and you can end up getting more return from that in the long term. Having that money now is worth more to you than having it in the future. But Broom thinks what works for commodities doesn't work for human lives. That's a different kind of category. So there's a lot more that we could say about that. You could have a whole class on discounting and the ethics of it, just on their own. But the important thing to know here is the distinction for Broom between discounting commodities and discounting lives, that he thinks it's okay in the case of commodities, but wrong in the case of human lives. But that raises a lot of questions now about, well, if the economic models typically do assign value to different outcomes using a discount rate, then we're going to need some other way to try and assign value to different outcomes into the future. So, for example, if one of the policies that we're looking at has some outcomes in which many people die in the future, well, if you discount that, right, if you use a discount rate and sort of you model this in economic terms, that won't look so bad, because if it happens far enough out, Well, it happens far out, so there's not much weight placed on it, so it's not too bad. But Broom thinks, well, no, those lives matter just as much as ours, so those deaths should be counted equally. How do you do that? He talks about a few ways in which you can. So, for example, trying to measure things in life years or quality of life years. So this gets a bit into medical ethics, where this is sometimes used. Um, the short version of this is that there's a lot of complications. There's a lot of uncertainty. But Broom thinks we can't just throw up our hands. We have to try our best to try and assign values, even though it's not easy, to different outcomes. And that has to involve, he thinks, an appreciation of the equality of lives over time, right? Whether it's some ancient Roman or whether it's some future person 2,000 years from now. From a moral point of view, there's no difference, right? Those persons have an equal right to life and well-being. Okay, so the last thing is the non-identity problem, which is a philosophical problem. It's attributed to a philosopher named Derek Parfit, who talked about this in his book called Reasons and Persons. This is somewhat complicated. Unlike expected utility, it's expected value. It's not complicated in terms of numbers or anything like that, but conceptually it can be a bit confusing. So I'll do my best to try and explain it. So the first thing we have to notice is that which individuals are born in the future will depend in large part on the choices that humans make today. So to see this, think about your own existence. So think about everything that had to go exactly a certain way over the past centuries in order for you to have been born. So go back a couple hundred years and change one major historical event, and that might have completely changed when the Industrial Revolution happened. It might have changed immigration patterns across the world. You make one, say, big change, even small changes could do it, but make one big change in the past, and it can completely alter who moves where, who meets whom, who reproduces when, how many children they have. And you can start to see that, it was really lucky that we were born. So many things had to go exactly right. Imagine the Industrial Revolution didn't happen, right? And well, your ancestors probably would have not moved from wherever they were located beforehand, right? Probably never would have emigrated, or whichever one it is. And your parents probably never would have existed, and you never would have been born. So that holds for the future too. The choices that we make today regarding, for example, climate policy could have a really big impact socially and economically on the world. And that'll likely change behavior. So, for example, one possible policy mechanism would be to put a carbon tax on activities that emit greenhouse gases, to make them more expensive, to try and account for the costs that are external to what you actually pay. So you get gas for your car. In a sense, you're not paying the full cost of that gas because much of it gets pushed off onto others in the forms of pollution and climate change. So imagine that governments pass laws that tax that activity, and now becomes much more expensive to burn fossil fuels, to rely on energy from that, to get gas, things like that. So maybe people switch to more expensive forms of renewable energy. And maybe that squeezes their finances, where maybe before they would have had 3 children, now they have just 2, or maybe they wait longer to have children. It'll change the economics of the country and the world in a way in which it might affect who goes to college, when they do, what kind of jobs they get. And you can start to see that, yeah, what policies we choose today could result in a world that's very, very different from what it might otherwise be. A world in which different people are born and come into existence. Um, so this is the non-identity part. So if we choose policy A rather than policy B, right, over time, the people who are born under each of those policies start to diverge and become non-identical. They're not the same identities. Different people exist in those different scenarios. So that's just the non-identity part. So what's the problem with that? Well, there's an ethical problem in the following sense. So I think many of us assume that if we don't do anything to address climate change and we leave future generations with a very hot, dangerous world, that we've done something bad for those people, right? And you might say unethical, unconscionable, but even if you don't think that, it seems intuitive to say that, well, yeah, I mean, if those people in the future are dealing with a bunch of hurricanes and heat waves and a wrecked economy and so on because of our choices, then yeah, we've done something bad to them, right? But the non-identity issue raises a puzzle here. So you might say, right, if you could talk to those people in the future, which you can't, but imagine that you could, and they said, hey, you guys caused this dangerous climate change and we're suffering, you shouldn't have done that. You could come back and say, all right, well, maybe we shouldn't have. We should have chosen the policy that cut our emissions. But then you guys in the future never would have been born. You owe your existence to the fact that we didn't cut our emissions. Because it was only for that reason that people behaved as they did, that people reproduced when they did, ultimately resulting in a couple centuries from now, you individuals existing. So are you saying you wish that we cut our emissions, pursued a different path? All right, but then you're wishing that you yourselves had never been born, right? So now you can start to see the problem here. Because of non-identity, it doesn't seem like I've done anything wrong to those future individuals, right? If anything, they should be thankful because their existence depends upon the fact that we chose what we did in the past. So you might say, what are you complaining about? Don't you like existing? As long as their lives are worth living, right? They might not be great, but as long as they're not miserable, right? As long as they feel like they're better off alive than dead, then you might say we've done something beneficial for you. Right? Yeah, it's dangerous climate change, but wouldn't you rather exist than not exist? So that's the problem, right? That intuitively it seems like it would be really messed up to make policy choices in the present that lead to a world of dangerous climate change in the future. But the question is, well, bad for whom, right? Well, it's not exactly bad for the individuals who are born. If anything, it's good for them, right? Because now they've come into existence. It's not like they would have been better off if we had cut our emissions. They wouldn't have existed at all. They wouldn't have been born. So it feels like it's wrong, right, to impose dangerous climate change on the future. And yet it's hard to say exactly who the victim would be if we did that, right? Because in one sense, nobody is made worse off. And that's kind of a puzzle, right? So Parfit and others assume, and Broom thinks too, that it is a problem because it feels like obviously we have duties to future generations, right? But how can that be the case if the identities of future... I think it was the mail coming. All right, settle down. It's okay. She's all right. So to resume, it feels like we have duties to future generations, but how could that be the case when the identities of those future generations depend upon our choices? It's not like ethics in the present day, right? I have an obligation not to punch you and steal your bike. And you might say, I've harmed you, I've made you worse off, right? Because if I hadn't done that, well, you wouldn't have been punched and you'd still have your bike. So, that makes sense. You're worse off in the scenario in which I do that than in the scenario in which I don't. So you have a good basis for complaint. And I've done something wrong by making you worse off. But when it comes to actions that affect the further future, our choices actually decide who gets born in the future. And they can't say that they're worse off in that future than they would have been in a scenario in which they didn't exist. Because, well, you can't compare those two things. Are you better off in the world of dangerous climate change, in which at least you exist, or in the world in which you don't exist? Well, seems like you're better off in the world in which there's dangerous climate change. So that's kind of a puzzle, or it's a problem. And there's various solutions that have been suggested. But Broom has a couple suggestions. We'll just focus on his. So one thing he points out is that although non-identity is the case for the distant future, for the near term, it's not, or at least not completely. So our choices with respect to climate policy will affect some people who haven't been born yet, and those people will exist regardless of what we do. Right? So imagine somebody who's going to be born in 4 years, right? Even if we drastically cut our emissions, that won't be enough time to change the fact that that person will be born in 4 years. So that person can compare his or her well-being to the world of dangerous climate change, right? Because say they live a long life, so they're going to be around in 80 years. They could compare that to the world in which we got around to actually cutting our emissions and trying to do something for the future. That person is not subject to the non-identity problem because they exist in both scenarios. So Broom thinks that at least for a while, there'll be overlap between our policies in terms of who exists. It is true, though, once you get far enough out, he admits that the people who exist will be at some point 100% non-identical in one scenario compared to another. But here Broom thinks duties of goodness kick in. So remember his distinction between duties of justice and duties of goodness. Duties of justice are owed to specific individuals. I have a duty to you not to punch you and steal your bike, I assume. I have a duty to respect individual human rights and all that stuff. But duties of goodness are impersonal. They're not owed to specific individuals, they're just generalized. Now, there's still obligations, right? They're not optional. You got to do it, according to Broom. But I have a lot of freedom in choosing who, where, when to try and make the world a better place. So Broom thinks when it comes to climate change, our duties of goodness require us and give us reason to prefer the climate policies that reduce suffering in the future and promote greater well-being. And because our duties of goodness, it doesn't matter if the people are, if their existence depends upon our choices or not, right? Because these duties are not owed to those future individuals, they're just general duties to make the world a better place. And Broom thinks it's pretty clear. A world that's 6 or 7 degrees warmer than it is now, in which people are suffering pretty badly, is worse, less good, than the world in which we limit warming, say, to 2 degrees, which is maybe possible, but hard to do, but 2, 2.5, 3, that's a world with much less suffering, all else being equal. So although I don't have a duty of justice to prefer the less dangerous world in the future, I do have a duty of goodness to prefer that. So that's how Broom kind of sidesteps the non-identity problem, right? To say that, well, when we're talking about the distant future, it's not duties of justice that matter, but rather duties of goodness. Okay, so those are the 3 main things I wanted to touch on. Like I said, they're fairly complex, not easy to get your head around. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Yeah, we just got to do our best with it. And you know, if you're unclear on some things, don't worry. Happy to help you out. All right. So I'll see you next week then, and good luck with everything. Thanks a lot.